Good afternoon. Thank you. In my role as Director of Public Policy for Creative Many Michigan, I spend a lot of time in Lansing at the state capitol, meeting with legislators and their staff. So I know firsthand how difficult it is to change or introduce new ideas for legislation, for legislators to consider making into law. That's why I am delighted to hear from David Hartwell today. David is the founder and president of a successful business in Minnesota and also is a conservation advocate as a volunteer. And he's here to tell us how he brought together seemingly odd bedfellows, conservationists and creatives to work together and successfully get voters to approve a statewide sales tax. I want to say that again, a statewide sales tax to support clean water, outdoor heritage, parks and trails, and the arts and cultural heritage. So David.
Well, thanks for having me. Been listening to Art all day. You're going to have to hear a little bit about the environment and conservation, because that's my shtick. I got to start this by just letting you know that for me, to get my head on straight, I got to go outside. The natural world is where I find I can sort of think right. And I believe strongly that we all need to have that right, and that conservation is a really important thing for our communities. Livable communities have green space in them, and communities without green space really aren't good. They're depressing. We've all been in them. So, to me, we need to figure out how all generations can relate to the environment, can relate to conservation. And you have to have an emotional connection to do that. And you get that through experience. So preservation to me is both about preserving things because it's the right thing to do when we need natural systems, and it's about preserving ourselves. And so when I look at conservation, and I do work in conservation, it's as much an economic justice issue to me as a conservation issue, because what's happened in the last 50 years is it has become harder and harder for people to actually get to and experience and touch the out of doors. It's the haves and have-nots. Who has access to land? It's harder to get to. It's more expensive. In Minnesota 50 years ago, anybody could buy a cabin up on the lakes, and we got 15,000. Our license plate says 10, but we've got 15,000 lakes. Anybody could have a cabin virtually. Today, that isn't the case. So we have to make provisions to ensure that that as a society, we're allowing people to do that. So with that as background, I've been involved in land protection for a long, long time. It goes back, I did my first conservation easement back in 1986, so almost 30 years ago. I started the Minnesota Land Trust, which is the only real land trust in Minnesota doing conservation easements, back in 1991. And I've been asked to be on a number of boards, environmentally oriented. Somewhere around 2000, two things happened to me. One was I sat in a Parks and Trails board meeting and listened to the lobbyists tell us how successful we'd been at the legislature, because we'd managed to get, in a 2-year period, $3 million of bonding to buy in holdings in state parks, and that was success. And the Nature Conservancy wrapped up their largest capital campaign, 5 years, and they raised $15 million, and that was success. And we were losing 60 acres a day to development. And it struck me that our success was really failure. It was huge failure. And we had to change that. So I figured the first thing you got to do is have a vision. And I, in my head, said, there are 3 parts of the vision. We have to define what success looked like, which to me was figuring out what we'd already protected. And in 2000, amazingly enough, we didn't have the GIS we have today that lets us easily do that. So it was a big task. We had to decide what success looked like for us. And then we had to define what that gap was and figure out how we were going to fill that gap and what it would take in resources. Then we had to propose a solution for that, and we had to implement it. And that was the premise that I entered the debate about how are we going to change environment in Minnesota. I started to build a coalition of people, mostly people involved in land protection. And we would get together once a month and we'd talk about how do we make progress, how do we make progress. We added more people. We included heads of agencies, park districts, and we finally got to a place where we had to actually start to raise some money, and we went for 6 years and some staff and never set up a real organization. We used a fiscal agent, and 10 people alone funded the entire effort. This was true venture capital. And I just have to say, those are my heroes. The people who invested at that level are really my heroes because they took a huge gamble that some crazy idea was actually going to go somewhere. So we started to think about how we're going to sell this. How are we going to sell what success is? And our vision of success became really large. And as I'm sure all of you have done, it's really easy to conceptualize something that's huge. And then to make it happen, that's a whole other matter. And we realized that the only way we were going to have enough resources was to get money out of the state. There isn't enough private philanthropy out there to do what we had in mind. So we knew we had a legislative issue. So we actually did a lot of work, and we published a very big white paper on the threats that we were facing as a state to our environmental health. Called it Minnesota Calling. It was frankly, we did all that work really just to give it to the legislators because they're the ones that were going to make the decision for us. We used the media to help influence that. And we started to do polling to figure out how we could sell the message. And what we discovered was what people in Minnesota cared about was water. So we had to think about what are we going to do? How are we going to craft our message to talk about water? 40% of the tested waters in Minnesota are viewed as impaired. We're the land of 10,000 lakes, and 40% of them are bad. That became the thing that we felt we could use to convince the voters in the legislature that something had to change. Our problem isn't point source pollution, it's non-point. It's everywhere out there. It's lawns, it's agriculture, and it's agriculture. And it's quantity and quality of water. So we began to figure out how we were going to put water into this equation that we were working on. We started to say, what are our funding methods going to be? And my original concept was, let's go out and put a tax on real estate transactions. We're trying to fund land protection. We'll tie land protection to real estate because that's fair. And we discovered very quickly that the real estate lobby was going to go to the mat with an unlimited amount of money to fight us because they were afraid if we happened to win that, they'd have to fight that battle everywhere else. And they saw that as a huge threat. So we had to back off that. Now, you'll think I'm crazy, but we decided we needed $2.5 billion over 25 years for land protection in Minnesota. And where do you get $2.5 billion? Well, the truth is where you can get it from is sales tax. So we decided we needed to get the legislature to change our sales tax structure. And there are a couple ways to do that. One, they can just pass a law and increase the sales tax. And we knew the next moment there was an economic problem, they'd change their minds. And all the work that we did would be for naught. So we decided what we needed to do was change our Constitution. And that's what we did. Not very easily. But we built this coalition. We had a really vibrant coalition going. We knew we had a water component that had to be there, and there was a whole water plan for how do we protect our waters. And a lot of land protections about protecting water, but there was a separate water issue. So we formally, in 2007, launched a lobbying effort to increase our sales tax through a constitutional amendment, increasing it 1/4% for 25 years. We wanted it permanent. We had to live with 25 years. That's actually $5 billion, not 2.5. We wanted to preserve our 2.5. And there'd been people talking about a habitat constitutional amendment for a while. They'd never gotten anywhere. We actually organized and organized well, I have to say. And when this became a reality, when it looked like the legislature might actually do it, and a constitutional amendment in Minnesota goes to the voters after the House and the Senate both pass the bill, the governor doesn't get to weigh in. So when it looked like the House and the Senate were going to do it, gee whiz, the parks people said, you know what, we want some of our own. And the arts community, who'd been looking for a permanent funding source for a long time, they said, geez, this would be a great way for us to get some money as well. And you've heard that legislation and legislatures are like making sausages. By God, it's true. So in the end, we came up with a bill, and it was 3/8% increase in our sales tax for 25 years, a third going to habitat, a third going to clean water, 14.5% to parks, and 19.5% to the arts and cultural heritage. And the bill was passed by both the House and the Senate. In Minnesota, we have a time when the legislature has to be out of session, and it got out of conference committee, and we ran out of time. We got promises from the legislature that the first thing they would take up was passage of the conference committee bill when they came back in session in January. So it left us with 3 huge issues to deal with. The first was most of my fellow conservationists felt like the arts group was stealing our deal. This was our deal, and all of a sudden the arts were in there. Depending on where you were in the conservation community, you felt stronger about it. The hunting and fishing people were livid. I mean, they were beyond livid. And we were a bunch of liberals anyhow. But to work with those liberals was really something. And our coalition didn't want to work with the arts folks, not at all. So I just did it anyhow. I had a breakfast with the folks from the Minnesota Citizens from the Arts, which were the folks who'd successfully made this become part of the bill. And there was a little bit of who's trusting who. But I was the incoming board chair of the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. I could relate to them. Larry Redmond, he was a lobbyist for a clean energy group. He could kind of relate to me. And we decided we had to figure out how to get our coalitions to work together. And in the end, we did. The parks groups, we just left them alone. But getting through that was a huge issue for us, building the trust between the coalitions. The second was we had a whole lot of people that said until the legislature actually passes this so we know it's going to the voters, We don't dare organize, because what would we tell people that we're raising money from if it doesn't come through? We've gotten your money, but now we're not going to use it. That'll destroy our credibility. So we can't do anything. And we had a choice. We had 18 months to organize or 10 months to organize. If we started in the summer of 2007, we had 18 months to put our campaign together. If we started in January, we had 10 months. Which would you rather have? So we couldn't get the coalition behind it. Frankly, I ended up hiring someone to put the coalition together. And January 1st, we hired a staff before the legislature came into session. We had a campaign that was raising money and was ready to go January 1st. And you know what? We had that person, I had that person, working with the arts groups at the same time. And by the time we got to January, issue 1 was gone. You know, everybody was working together because we'd been working together, except the sportsman groups. The third issue for us was the hunting and fishing community felt very strongly that we had to have a method by which the allocation of the funds, once it was actually passed, wasn't just in the hands of the legislature. And our coalition decided to get behind that. We actually did. We passed a bill to that effect during the 08 legislative session. The legislators really didn't care, because at that point there wasn't any money to play with. There was only a hope of money, so they didn't fight it very hard. But as a coalition, we had to spend time and effort doing that as well. So January 2008 comes, and the legislature, true to their word, passed our bill right away. And we were in business. We didn't know who was going to oppose us, how tough the competition was, but we were in business. And we established a budget of $6 million to pass the legislation. Now, I got to tell you, in Minnesota, to pass a constitutional amendment, you have to have a majority of the voters voting, who show up at the polls, voting for you. If you show up at the polls and you vote for president, and you don't vote for a constitutional amendment, that vote is considered a vote against. So we had to have 50% of the people who showed up at the polls voting for us, not 50% of the people who voted on the issue. And we knew that we were going to be successful or not by getting precinct by precinct those places that had a historic record of not voting for constitutional amendments to vote for them. And we spent a lot of time and effort figuring out how to get that done, and money. In the end, you know, and the $6 million we wanted to raise, that roughly equated to, for every penny that we spent, we'd get a return of $1,000. It wasn't a hard sell. Well, it was a hard sell. We raised $4 million to pass the amendment. We put a steering committee together, and then an executive committee of the campaign. A broad coalition. We worked it very hard. We spent a lot of money on media. We did things, you know, I'm not that political, but we ended up doing focus groups where we actually produced ads we thought the competition would produce, and then took voters' taste on how that would resonate with them. So we knew how to overcome those objectives. The arts groups, I got to tell you, they were great. They were great. They went out and promoted clean water. The arts groups promoted clean water because we knew that was how we were going to pass it. So the sporting groups wouldn't promote clean water. The conservationists would. The parks people just went along for the ride. But clean water carried the campaign. There is no question. Our polling showed without it we wouldn't have won. We had both a 501c3 that did education work just to get out the vote, because a no vote was a no vote. And then we had a 501c4, which is a political committee that did the lion's share of the work. We got, you know, I will tell you, I ended up at a meeting in New Mexico in October of 2008 as Lehman Brothers was going bankrupt, as the economy was falling apart. And there were dark moments because we knew if we failed, we just jeopardized environmental spending by the state. We'd given the legislators the rationale to cut environmental spending more than they had. If we failed, the stakes were more than just failing on this amendment. But I'll tell you, October of 2008 wasn't a time to feel very promising, that we could feel very good about our efforts. Our polling was good, but there was a lot of bad stuff going on. And we got to the vote, the night of the vote, 56% voted in favor of raising their taxes for 25 years. Today, I mean, it's $7.5 billion. And today, that's $60 million for the arts every year. It is doled out to some of the bigger groups, and then the State Arts Board gives it to the regional arts councils, who spreads it all over the state. It's amazing. One of the requirements is you have to put the logo on your work. You just can't imagine the places you see the logo. I can't imagine the places we see the logo. The habitat portion, it's a little over $100 million a year to protect our habitat in Minnesota, restore it and protect it through acquisition and restoration and conservation easements. The parks folks have rejuvenated the budgets of state parks and regional parks in a way that wouldn't have been possible. And we're making progress, maybe not as fast as many of us would like, but we're making progress on water, spending $100 million on clean water initiatives, some of which, by the way, is habitat. Because one of the ways you protect water is to have filter strips between pollution and the water, which just happens to be habitat. I've been very lucky. The group that I was resistant to help set up, which was the group to determine where the habitat money would go, is made up of 4 legislators and 8 citizens, and I was appointed to that board. I chaired it for 4 years, and it's been a real honor to go out and see what we can do, and to be able to make those kinds of allocations to projects that frankly nobody ever dreamed we could do. So my message to you is, you gotta have a vision, and you gotta have a big vision. And if you don't start with the big vision, you will not get anything done. You gotta have that, you know, BHAG, they call it, the big, hairy, audacious, whatever it is, but goal. We started with something, I mean, think about it, you know, our biggest conservation efforts in Minnesota had raised $18 million when we started this in 2000, and we ended up with $200 million a year, $250 million if you include the parks. We had a big vision of what it would take. And we got people behind it. It was not easy, it's risky, but without that vision, you won't get there. And the other piece is, figure out, when you do something like that, what the unintended consequences are in terms of structure. Because right now in Florida, they just passed a $1 billion a year constitutional amendment for clean water. And they thought they'd done a pretty good job, but they were so enamored with $1 billion a year, they didn't focus on the details. And now they got the sugar growers saying, you know, by law we have to clean up our act, but you can pay for it now. And you got municipalities saying, we haven't been able to get people to remove their septic systems, so you can pay for it now. The devil's in the detail on these things. And there are a few things in our bill where I wish we'd done it a little different and been a little more careful. But it matters. When you're doing this kind of work, those details really matter. But have the big vision, and you can accomplish amazing things. And we certainly did more than I ever thought was possible in Minnesota. and it's been great. So thank you very much.